Hello, everyone. This is Peter May with Maria Fernanda Giabara and Gunnars Platais, speaking about pandemics, conservation, and human-nature relations. Summarizing our results in our study of this topic, we are concerned here in speaking about the dilemma of the conflict between conservation of natural habitats and interference by human beings in those habitats that has led to the transmission of disease through channels of wildlife. What has been the historical record of these pandemics and the role of human-nature interactions in the transmission of pathogens? What are the principal vectors and drivers of viral transmission to humans from natural reservoirs, and how can they be mitigated? How are indigenous peoples faring with COVID-19, and how can conservation of their territories and their cosmovision contribute to solutions in the post-pandemic era? We couch this debate, first off, as a question of who is invading whom. Are the pathogens invading us, or are we invading the space of the wild creatures who are hosts to such organisms? You can see that the constant anthropic incursion in natural environments, the detrimental effects of logging in tropical forests, humankind's continual assault on natural habitats and biodiversity, and the stimulation of agricultural frontiers leading to forest conversion have all resulted in animals being forced into smaller and smaller ecological niches. And that brings them into more closer relationship with humans. Then we ask, is the pandemic then nature's revenge? As we can see then, 70% of all pandemics are caused by zoonotic transmission. The recent United Nations Environment Program Frontiers Report in 2016, presaging future disasters, showed that with a warning that zoonoses threaten economic development, animal and human well-being, and ecosystem integrity. Over the last few years, several emerging zoonotic diseases made world headlines as they caused or threatened to cause major pandemics. These include, as listed in the below table, Ebola, avian influenza, Middle East respiratory syndrome, MERS, the Rift Valley fever, sudden acute respiratory syndrome, SARS, the West Nile virus, and Zika virus disease. The pathogens causing these diseases have wildlife reservoirs, shown in conjunction with their human domesticated animal transmitters, in its reservoirs that serve as their long-term hosts. In the last 2 decades, emerging diseases have had direct costs of more than $100 billion. If you add up several of these and others that also have occurred. If these outbreaks had become human pandemics, the losses would have amounted to several $1 trillion, and that's what we're seeing in the case of COVID-19. I want to close this section with some conclusions with regard to the rights to food and life. Know that some of the responses by authorities to wildlife transmission of COVID-19 were to ban consumption of wild animals and to close wet markets. The proximity of the animals to people were among the factors that were considered to have caused the transmission of COVID to the population of Wuhan. There is a conflict over protected areas and the use of wildlife as a source of food, and the objective of reducing poaching and the intended exposure to pathogens are both good reasons to close up natural reserves as a source of food. But Traditional and informal markets are essential sources of food for hundreds of millions of poor people. What are the benefits of safeguarding land tenure and forest to those millions who rely on wildlife for a considerable share of the protein and micronutrients they require? These questions have their roots in contesting the right to food, an issue of ethics rather than monetary calculus. There's no doubt that the public health risk of exposure to further pandemics outweighs the local benefits that are derived by those who convert forests to grow soybeans or plant pastures for cattle. Therefore, protecting the benefits derived from intact ecosystems and low-impact wildlife exploitation, as demonstrated by forest-dwelling and dependent peoples, will help us avert exposure to wily pathogens in the future.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for your interest in our presentation. My name is Gunnar Splattheis, and I will present the section on causal vectors of zoonosis and drivers of zoonotic transmission. In an earlier 2019 report by EcoHealth for the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, the authors point out that although changes in land use practices have benefited people through economic and social development, they have also led to long-term negative impacts on human health and the provision of ecosystem services. Critically, there is increasing evidence that land use change is a major driver of emerging infectious diseases. As this pie chart shows, and corroborating the previous studies, 31% of emerging infectious diseases affecting people are causally linked to land use change. This includes deadly diseases such as HIV/AIDS, Ebola, and Zika virus, all of which originated in altered forest landscapes. Even though wildlife consumption is an important route to increased exposure to such pathogens, it is not the only one. A recent study of the drivers that have led to the liberation of disease-causing pathogens from the Brazilian Amazon found the following direct and indirect pathways, among which significant dynamic interactions occur: human migration, vector dynamics, roads and transportation, habitat loss and pathogen spillover, climate change and extreme weather events, flooding and water pollution, agricultural and land use, prostitution, hunting and bushmeat consumption, hydroelectric dam construction and irrigation systems, biodiversity loss, urbanization and deurbanization, and mining. Thank you for your attention. My colleague Maria Fernanda Guevara will now finalize our presentation with a look at the impact these pathogens have on indigenous peoples and what we can do about all of this.
Hello everyone, I'm Maria Fernanda Guevara and I'm going to present the final part of our presentation, which is about the impact of COVID to indigenous peoples and what we can do about it. Indigenous groups are less susceptible to pathogens due to millennia of contact and consumption of wild hosts, but settlers brought novel pathogens to which indigenous populations had not been exposed before. And this has caused tremendous risks, and indigenous groups have been decimated since colonial times. COVID-19 has spread rapidly among indigenous peoples in the Amazon, with over 1,878 deaths by September 2020, many being elderly. The mortality rate among indigenous people is nearly double the norm, coupled with absence of medical attention and food security, and provocative legislative proposals to open indigenous land to mineral and agriculture exploitation. forest destruction is going to be inevitable if indigenous peoples who have served as barriers against deforestation are no longer able to protect forest ecosystems and their wildlife. And in reality, areas considered pristine in terms of natural value were in fact sustainably managed by local inhabitants in the Amazon for centuries and centuries. Such knowledge is then crucial if we want to avoid the emergence of novel pathogens, but the pandemic may actually inflict irreparable damage on indigenous knowledge. Nature is composed not only of charismatic species and carbon-absorbing plants, but also by pathogenic organisms whose genetic drive is for survival and reproduction. So if we want to avoid their spillover to humans, we need to find ways of better guaranteeing the enforcement of global agreements and targets, such as the Aichi biodiversity targets, but also protect indigenous rights. So, is it really nature's revenge, as many have been saying? Well, if we think that bacteria, which are a type of pathogen, was the first being alive on Earth, maybe we would have another perception of things. We could be even thankful to pathogens for reproducing themselves, evolving, and allowing us to be here. We would better acknowledge their power over us and would not be so surprised that a very small being is able to make such a damage. This shows how interconnected we are with other than human beings and how any being can be truly distinct and powerful. Indeed, there are no others. We are these beings as well, an open system. And this is what indigenous cosmologists say. It is important then to stop with human speciesism and start thinking about multi-speciesisms. And this is just a small taste of what the climate crisis portends and how we can respond as a mature species. So I don't think it's a revenge, but an opportunity given to us by these small beings that gave us life to rethink our relationship with the rest of nature. So thinking on how to move forward and what type of politics we could try to achieve in a post-COVID world, if there is a post-COVID world, we may just learn how to live with it. It's important to step outside of the human nature dichotomy and reimagine political systems. The concept of cosmopolitics is a good start, as it includes different parts of the cosmos as beings of rights. And this concept, which was first thought by Isabel Stengers, is actually reflected in an emergent indigenous movement that is happening in governance in different parts of the world, such as Ecuador, Bolivia, New Zealand, and it's also being discussed in different arenas, such as the United Nations. So finally, what can we do about it? We have already covered some of the points here, but it is important to emphasize the need to change our perception of forests as just a commodity or service provider and awake intrinsic, symbolic, and relational values that recognize our interdependency with these wild landscapes. Also, it is crucial to allow for the co-production of knowledge and better integrate and recognize indigenous knowledge as valuable knowledge. Indigenous knowledge can circumvent many of the ecological and health crises we are facing, generating a systemic understanding of complex environments and integrating numerous variables qualitatively. So we better start fighting for such knowledge before it's too late. So thank you very much for your attention, and here are our contact details in case you want to be in touch. Thank you.